So let me walk through a few preliminaries here before we get started. So I'd first like to just welcome everyone to this PDW on building a research agenda and community for the Anthropocene epoch. And thank you again, everyone, for your time and energy to make this happen. The pandemic, of course, is still happening in many places. And like the global climate change crisis before it, it really demonstrates the need for creative organizational solutions to pressing problems. The goal today is to have a generative, constructive conversation about the state of organizations and the environment in the Anthropocene. I think we're all joined together by this interest in researching organizations going into the future of a geologic epoch that is defined by human domination of planetary environmental systems. Today's session brings together distinguished scholars who share this interest. We also disagree sometimes, and sometimes fundamentally, on perspectives, approaches, and best solutions to problems. So we're not here to settle those debates necessarily, but we are here to harness our collective agreements and disagreements to generate a research program on the Anthropocene that can contribute to building the research community around these issues. I'll be moderating today's conversation along with Andy and Dev, and they will be participating primarily as panel discussants. And Dev will be recording some of the key additional questions, claims, and debates. I'll start each segment that was in the agenda with a prompt. And then I'll ask someone to share their comments to get us started. And then others can respond to previous speakers as well as add their own insights. Some logistics: remain muted when not speaking. And to indicate that you'd like to speak, use the raise hand function in the participants panel or indicate in the chat box that you would like to contribute. And then I'll turn the conversation over to you. There will be some difficulties with moderation given the technological limitations of this platform, and I'm sure some of you have experienced these, but also given the intellectual force of this group of distinguished scholars, and I ask for your patience as I moderate. The session will be recorded. So today's questions fall into roughly three categories. The first is about the Anthropocene and whether there is something different from prior research on organizations and the environment. What parameters have changed in the Anthropocene that require us to study things in a different way or a new way. The second broad category is whether the Anthropocene requires us to work within or replace the system of capitalism. And the third area is the role of the physical sciences and how we might merge the physical and the social sciences. So we're going to begin with our first question. What is different about the Anthropocene, if anything? What does it mean for organizations and the environment research? And I'll just wait for someone to volunteer to start us off, and then we'll be ready to go and have a conversation.
I can't find the raised hand, but I'll get it started.
Sure.
To my mind, I mean, the Anthropocene represents a systemic failure. And it does raise questions for our purposes on whether it changes the level of analysis from the single product or the single organization to thinking more about systemic dimensions of our impact on the natural world. So maybe that is just a very vanilla way to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. And we also have Paul, who has raised his hand.
Yeah, just building on what Andy says just now, that strikes me as the heart of the matter. It seems like until the reality of our Anthropocene sunk in, it made a lot of sense for management scholars to focus their work on in firms, the way they work internally, the way they compete, perhaps the way they interact with the political system around them. But having reached this inflection point where the persistence of civilization as we know it on the planet is in danger as a result of the process of climate change that we've catalyzed, the other devastation that we've wrought on the ecosystems on which we depend, it seems like we're fiddling while Rome burns if we keep our traditional focus of research at that firm, interfirm level. Somehow, as management scholars, as organization scholars, we're summoned to have something pertinent to say that takes us to that more systemic level, the broader system of industrial production, whether we frame this in terms of capitalism or industrial society or productivist ideology. Somehow we need to get at that broader level.
And Zlatko, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The question is, of course, which systems are involved here, or how can we understand them better? And a Schumpeterian or neo-Schumpeterian perspective might be helpful here. So Schumpeter looked at capitalism as a series, or characterized by a series of technological revolutions. And in these technological revolutions, some neo-Schumpeterians argue we have some core inputs. And in 2 or 3 revolutions, core inputs were coal and oil. And so they were used so much that it has a cumulative effect on organizations and industry and society. And that is the aspect of the Anthropocene. And at the same time, from a neo-Schumpeterian perspective, you have in the middle of these technological revolutions a crisis, which is the political and social economic crisis. And this crisis we had in the 1930s, last century, and we are at a similar crisis now. So from this altogether Schumpeterian perspective, we have a mix of the economic, social, political crisis and the climate crisis. And this mix is a very dangerous mix. As we have seen in the 1930s, it led to fascism, it led to World War II, to genocide. And as Paul said, it's a really serious point we are at the moment.
Hey, Nick, I can't raise my hand if you don't mind. I'd like to chime in on.
Absolutely, yeah.
On that. I think, so to me, when we think about the Anthropocene, for organizations, O&E, Organization of Environment Studies, I think I agree with everything everybody else has said, by the way, but I think it really requires us to take on a more Schumpeterian and systemic view of how we do our research. What I mean by that is the question of how we make existing large organizations behave themselves a little bit better, perhaps is not adequate. And I'm not very optimistic about it personally. I think a much more pertinent and interesting question is how do we and when do we see those kinds of broad systematic changes where existing organizations, products, services are simply replaced? I think that's the only pathway that gets us there in any kind of a reasonable time frame. And I think it really puts the onus on us as organization scholars to understand that, because many of our colleagues in other sciences simply don't look at those questions very carefully. So I think we have a more pertinent and urgent role to play given the current landscape.
And John, go ahead. You have your hand up, and then Irene.
Yeah, I just had a quick thought about what I think is the dominant approach to studying management and organizations when it comes to the environment. And it's the idea that there's likely to be, and there already is, quite a bit of voluntarism. And individual firms, the proper unit of analysis would be the individual firm, if we're comfortable with the idea that firms en masse would do things voluntarily and proactively, perhaps in line with science-based goals. That continues, in my mind, to be a good fantasy for us to, or something aspirational. I mean, we can hope that that's going to happen, but my view is that it's not going to happen. It hasn't and it won't. And so then I think we go to more the other perspectives introduced by Andy, which is what level of pressure, coercion, force is necessary, and who is going to leverage existing firms. if it's not going to happen voluntarily. If it's going to happen voluntarily, we just study firms that are leaders and assume everybody else is going to come along with it. But I don't know if anybody here thinks voluntarism is going to work or proactivity is a real thing, except in our research literature where we celebrate proactivity. And, you know, it's a beautiful thing if it happens, and if it happens at a strong sustainability level instead of a weak sustainability level. But it seems like we often celebrate the weak sustainability movements, even at the level of the individual firm. So I think ratcheting up to probably where Paul and Zlatko were intimating or suggesting would make more sense. But which agent? You know, is it big government?
Thank you, John. And Irene, make sure we get to your comment as well.
Thank you. And it's fascinating to listen to everyone. I think we have, probably as scholars sometimes, have done a disservice to the field, and I'm responsible for it as well. All right. I mean, I've started in this field 30 years, and now I'm thinking about what is it that we can do instead of, you know, just same old. And the idea is that, you know, insofar as government's concerned, if they use their money, for aid or for anything, they have to say, what do we get from this? What is the best approach? What works? What doesn't work? We don't do that enough in management. We've got to do more design thinking about how do we design this to be better. And I think we're not doing that. And by doing design, you think about the entire system. And so these are the things, and we're not measuring impact. We're stopping at the firm. We're not going beyond the firm. And I know it's hard, right? I'm not saying it's easy. Instead of big data, maybe we need smaller data. So look at what works, what doesn't work. This is what I think management is crying out for more, is finding out how things are going to work. So if I have a choice with my money to either help, and let's say an education issue, I either go for, I don't know, maybe school lunches, or I go for, I don't know, buying them books, or I do something. Which one works best? Which one will help students the most in achieving a certain goal? The SDGs are prime examples. What are the approaches where we can actually meet those SDGs? We can provide that information. We can do, you know, random controlled trials. We can work on this. There are techniques to do this. There are abilities. We can do so much more. And so that's what I'm hoping. And I'm now working with indigenous communities, and they're telling us our worldviews are just wacko. I mean, they say we have to work within the system. That's what we do. We only take with what we need. And so these are the things that are really fascinating. So, you know, as I get older, hopefully I get wiser, and I'm hoping to share some of those ideas with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, and welcome, Maggie.
Hi.
Hi. We're going to go to Bobby next. And Maggie, if you have something you'd like to contribute, we're talking about what the Anthropocene is, how the Anthropocene is different, what kinds of alternative approaches we might need. So if you'd like to comment, just raise your hand in the participants section or enter in the chat, or just wave. I'll be trying to monitor that. So, Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at a different unit of analysis. I don't believe the organization is the correct unit of analysis. Organizations can do very little. They operate in a larger system of political power. So my analysis is mainly at the level of political economy and social theory. And I guess I might probably depart from the conventional thinking. I actually don't think the Anthropocene marks such a fundamental and radical break in our thinking, historically speaking. So I take a post-colonial perspective of this. And for me, the history of the Anthropocene mirrors the history of modernity. They're both written from the perspective of the Enlightenment. So even the geological time scale was an invention of the Enlightenment, right? So this transformation from pre-modern to modern is very much an Enlightenment narrative, right? That's also the Anthropocene story. So to the list of Enlightenment notions of progress, capitalism, democracy, freedom, human rights, not to mention colonialism and imperialism, which are also Enlightenment projects, we can just add to this list species extinction, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, pollution, melting ice caps. I think what makes the Anthropocene different from previous geological epochs is that the Anthropocene is the only scene where the active agent, which is us, is actually trying to define what the scene is. That's the only difference I see. But in terms of the epistemological blindness of this narrative, I said, denies the histories of race, of colonialism in terms of building this narrative. So even if you look at the key markers, I think there's only one or two who acknowledge that, but then they moved right on. So one of the key markers was that famous Orbis spikes in 1610, when the first time the CO2 emissions declined because of the genocide of indigenous peoples. That's just mentioned as a footnote. So I'm in the middle of writing a paper called "Is the Anthropocene White?" So I'm looking at a completely different set of literature. And even the second marker, which is this presence of nuclear radiation in the atmosphere, which was not there, which was a man-made concept. Much of that nuclear testing was done on islands with indigenous tribal people. So the degree of irradiation of tribal people is disproportionately much higher than anybody else. And again, those racialized histories are erased. So I guess I come from a slightly different perspective in trying to problematize who the we is. So when you said we are fucked, I want to know who the we is. And I try to break that down in the analysis.
Thank you, Bobby. I want to I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to contribute. So that some of the things we've been talking about reminded me of some of Seray's work on feminist perspectives and this concept of ecologies of sustainable concerns. And Seray, would you like to add that now, or do you feel like that would be appropriate later?
I can certainly mention about that. I was actually thinking right now so feminist perspectives brings a different perspective because it takes the view from the disadvantaged communities. What I was actually thinking about how Anthropocene is different from our previous times. Well, one thing, it's different in terms of the scale, as picking up from the planetary boundaries argument and the reaching of these nitrogen, oxygen, carbon and biogeochemicals or oceans warming types of more planetary scale issues. And this is not just about one organization polluting river or polluting the ground water sources of local communities. So we cannot respond it by, just isolating organization by organization to doing waste reduction, etc. So that's one thing different. But the second thing is, I think that coming to the Bobby and also feminist perspectives, I feel like the unequal effects of this Anthropocene will be actually similar, similar in the sense that it's going to be impacting unequally to disadvantaged communities, which has been already like that for the past many years. So that's not going to change, but it's going to get worse, and that's for sure. The wealthy will be able to may pay out their way out of the natural disaster. I mean, we're seeing from the hurricanes, the insufficient infrastructure, for instance, in Flint, Michigan. I mean, it's already impacting the disadvantaged already, and it's going to get worsened. So that part is not so different from the previous parts, but in terms of the scale, I think that's different. And feminist perspectives always look from the power relations view, from the haves and have-nots view. So that's why ecologies of sustainable concerns bring a different lens to understanding Anthropocene, and even talking about Anthropocene, there are lots of discussions whether we should call it Anthropocene or Capitalocene or Econocene or many zillion names that wouldn't signify the whiteness and the male dominance of masculine dominance of this group.
Thank you. And Paul, you've had your hand up for a while, and then after your comment, I'll kind of ask we'll go to Andy. I just saw his hand, and then I'll ask a provocation based on what we've heard so far. Go ahead, Paul.
I think Maggie wanted to get in too, but so
sure.
My comment, just a brief one. I wanted to build on a comment that Bobby made and also on Zlatko's earlier comment. You asked, I think the core of the question you were posing to us is, how does the Anthropocene change our goals in organizational research, or how does it change the nature of the work we do as management scholars? And I think one simple point I'd like to introduce in the conversation is that I think it creates an obligation for us as organization scholars to expand the intellectual sources of our work towards political economy, amongst other possible disciplines. But management scholarship is very used to engaging in dialogue with psychology, with economics, sometimes with political science. But the whole world of political economy, the whole intellectual tradition of political economy, is being sort of over the horizon from management scholarship in almost entirely. And I think the Anthropocene forces us to bone up on this other field of scholarship and find what we can learn from them. And as management scholars, we may have something to bring to folks who work in political economy too. But I think that's the challenge that I see as an intellectual level.
Okay, one thing, the co-hosts have learned a new function on Zoom. The co-hosts can't raise their hands, so.
Yeah, I saw that in the comment. I'll be watching for you waving frantically.
To build on what we're doing here, I feel three tensions. One, we're talking about expanding the level of analysis, getting into political economy, and I totally agree with that. A lot of talk has said we need to think on systems, and I find there's a lot of hand waving there. I don't know what that means. It's a nice idea. Let's think systemically, but how do we do that? How do we bring it down to a level that is understandable and actionable? And you know, Dev and I have done a lot of work on the comparisons to the Enlightenment. Bobby's brought that up as well, and that's great as an intellectual exercise. But in terms of actionable results, systems change, that becomes problematic. And so I'm hoping that one thing that will come out of this session is at least the beginnings of some of the discrete questions that systemic change means. Is it issues of time? Is it issue of shareholder primacy? Whatever it may be, bringing in disadvantaged voices. I'm not sure what it is, but we need to start to bring it down into a more granular level to make it useful and actionable and researchable beyond what could easily be dismissed as hand raising. And then secondly, there seems to be a very strong, and I agree with it, a normative focus to our discussion, not just an academic enterprise, but how do we actively try and drive change? Because after all, we are part of this experience. We're researching a world that's changing, of which we are a part. And I think it's impossible to do that dispassionately. We're effectively committing mass suicide, and we're going to sit here in our nice offices and study it as an intellectual exercise. I find that bizarre. So with that, I do think it's interesting, and I just want to call it out that the characters in this conversation, to my mind, do represent different communities on both those questions. We have the more managerial folks and the more critical folks, and they each bring something that if we can start to pull that energy back together again, the critical perspective, the managerial perspective, to start to really develop a research agenda that drives change, could be a good outcome from this session.
Thank you, Andy. And Maggie, go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone. And I was going to talk about system thinking, but now I'm not sure I should. But so I think that the difference, I mean, what we are realizing today, as you said, Andy and others, that we need to do something. There's an urge of action. We don't have time, all of that. And I think that over the last 20 years, like the research that we've done is in some ways quite timid. I feel we've tried to kind of gain legitimacy and we say, okay, let's make sure that what we do is recognized and published in 8 journals. And so that now we exist as scholars. And in doing so, we've kind of, followed the mold, the norms that might or might not be actually, useful. They're very kind of centered towards, talking to among ourselves. And now I think we do have this legitimacy, so great. But what about the real impact? And I think Irene just published recently a fantastic paper along with Brian Osted and Barnett, right? So on kind of, we need to look at impact on the environment, not just, making the case for, does it pay to be green, and looking at financial, kind of benefits of sustainability. And I think it's, a big change of, how do we look at what we do, how do we change the metrics. But I think also, in addition, I would say we need to look at not kind of what firms have done and study them as if they were like just inert objects, but because that's looking backward. We need to experiment with them. We need to work with them to find innovations, to be kind of actor of these changes. So I think that's kind of also a change of how we see research, rather than just running regressions of case studies on what firms are doing, saying, can we work together hand in hand with these actors to try new things? And I know it's much harder than what we've done, because the firms are not always willing to share. They don't, they have confidentiality issues. They have different timeline in terms of what they want to do. But if we don't try new things, if you are not actors of this research, then we're just leaving the responsibility and everything, to these organizations that don't really want to change. So I would just encourage us to be a little bit more action oriented. And also, I think sometimes we're using the wrong methodologies. We've been relying a lot on statistical analysis, and really what we're doing is identifying one single variable and making it like that, the paper where we identify that new thing. And that is supposed to be very significant. But what we're doing is we're identifying one variable, controlling for everything else. And it's not the way things work, right? We're not going to make changes by just changing, adopting one single practice, or just, kind of doing one thing at a time. In fact, organizations, as we know, kind of, they do various things, and it's kind of a bundle of things that we're doing. So that's going to the system thinking. Maybe it's not just, kind of everybody together, but maybe we need to look to use different methodologies also to look at the clusters of actions, of practices that actually drive change. And that's, going to system thinking, maybe what we need to do, and that's to go back to Andy's question. Yes, it's hard because, just so many variables, so many things, moving pieces. And maybe what we need is to think about, coordination system. How do we connect the different pieces? What are the connectors? And focus on that level of analysis. So this is just my little rumbling here.
And Maggie, what you're saying makes me think one thing we could do is, in teaching, promote the value of experimentation and collaborating with academics once people go out into businesses and become decision makers.
Right.
To build that infrastructure out.
Students, keep our students as helping us to do this,
And Dev, I see your hand is up, so I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Bobby and John and Jeff.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, everybody. I appreciate all the comments, and I think they're wonderful. I guess one of the issues we were wrestling with in trying to pull together this PDW, as Andy was talking about, is how to organize some of our disparate works and perspectives. And I do think systems thinking matters. And as Magali was just saying, action-oriented, certain locus of action to tackle. But I also think that we need to consider beyond systems sort of cultures of domination. I think there are cultures that are out there that are more resilient to change, more inert, really tough. I sit in Alberta, in the capital of oil sands, and I've got massive amounts of construction culture outside of my house that just swirls and continues and swirls as part of a growth machine. And that's a particular culture that needs its own sort of intense focus in order to move at all. There are other cultures that are much more progressive around the planet that we can foster and help. So I do think systems matters, but I do think that thinking about that cultural milieu around the system is really important if we're going to move to political economy kind of level. I just if we don't wrestle with that culture of domination issue, which is one of the reasons I think Andy and I, we've been thinking a lot about cultural re-enlightenment or some shift in that sense. So it's not just what we know on the tech systems side, frankly. Yeah, I just wanted to raise that in as part of the discussion of Anthropocene. Yeah.
Thank you, Dev, and I'll turn it to John now. Some people had their hands up for a while, so we'll work through those now.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Let's see if I can put a point on something that I've been hearing in a couple of echoes. I think Andy might have launched the idea that there's a normative focus in what we do, or there should be, or there. Since the beginning of the One research tradition, there's been a real effort to establish scientific legitimacy. And we've used a lot of good methods and statistics, and as Magali's saying, pretty advanced modeling techniques and so on. But this issue of the normative is what really grabs my attention right now when I'm thinking about what's needed in the Anthropocene. I mean, just think about what's going on in the era, the apocalyptic era, potentially, of Trump, Bolsonaro, this growth machine that is on pause at the moment, but will resume, you know, as soon as somebody comes up with a vaccine. So, I mean, this normative issue is a vexing one, but one mistake I think we could make as we study environment as critical scholars or aspiringly critical scholars is we could assume that because we're more explicit about our normative position and the values that we believe should be advanced, that we're the only ones who have normative dispositions. But I mean, there's a major normative component to the mainstream management scholarship. I mean, those folks have a set of entrenched assumptions, a dominant paradigm. And I don't consider myself part of that, but it's easy to get sucked into it and to believe our legitimacy stems from that. But I think the idea about normativeness is crucial, but let's maybe remember that everybody has a normative position. Because you make yours explicit and it sounds different from the mainstream, doesn't mean you're any more or less ideological or political. It just means you've made it explicit and it's different.
Thank you, John, and we'll go to Jeff next.
I was busy thinking about what John had said. I think that's really insightful. I think when we start to talk about normative as being our set of beliefs, that's really problematic because, yeah, I mean, I think all of us, or at least I'm sure actually all of us, have experienced being the outsider within our department, division, some set of management scholars in which our field of interest is considered normatively problematic in that it undermines the legitimacy of the entire management scholarship undertaking. So, you know, that's something you got to battle against. But I wanted to comment about what Magali was saying was actually very much where I wanted to go. And when Andy was talking about the problem with systems thinking, getting ready for this session, I was just going back and reading some of the more recent stuff on the Anthropocene from other fields. And it's really interesting. I mean, and I've also been doing this project where we've been reviewing the social and environmental entrepreneurship literature. And I consider myself a proponent and part of that literature. But I gotta say, going back and reading about, you know, a couple of hundred papers over the past few months, boy, there are very few that focus on any kind of outcome that these people were seeking, other than maybe they were economically sustainable or not. I mean, I could count them on maybe one or two hands at the most. So I think there's a lot to be said for what Magali was saying is like focusing in this realm on specifically on the planetary boundaries or a subset of the sustainable development goals, thinking about how do we actually start to measure organizational change and outcomes, and also getting to that across levels. I feel like a lot of times we take social movements or public entities and make them a moderator in our models. And perhaps thinking about the other way where the organizations are actually co-evolving with those, or I should say capitalist for-profit organizations, companies, are co-evolving aligned with those other actors are the way we need to think about this. I'm not saying that's a perfect solution, but in my mind anyway, that gets us down the field a little bit towards a more systems thinking perspective. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. And Bobby, you've been waiting patiently.
It was more to respond to Andy's provocation about, and I agree with him that when we don't have any answers or we are lost, we immediately say, okay, systems theory is the answer. We really don't know what's going on. And as I said, I have lots of problems with system theory. It's a complete unsophisticated analysis of power and domination. And I think one of you mentioned that just now. Power is almost like an endogenous variable attached to a model. And it's completely, the issues of culture are not addressed at all. And it's precisely the counter to the political economy. And I know political economy is defined in different ways, so I just want to make it clear. I have a very simple definition where I come from. Political economy refers to the distribution of power across society. So when I approach it that way, we have a different set of questions emerge. And there's a lot of, I guess, people who are working on this try to make a difference. These small scale projects in Latin America, started in Colombia actually, from the development anthropologists, who basically started the assumption that the system is broken, system doesn't work for us, we can't fix the system, we have no power. We're going to work within whatever system there is to come up with alternatives. So this is the political ecology perspective, mainly from indigenous tribes in Latin America, and now it's spreading to other parts as well. Very small scale projects. Yes, we can talk about capitalism as much as we want, even if tomorrow morning by some miracle, capitalism is vanished from the face of the earth, from the earth, we're still going to have the environmental problems. And I don't know of any socialist utopia model of production where growth is not privileged. So those systems of production, they're not going to solve the problem anyway. So these are small scale projects looking at degrowth, different ways of living with the land, different definitions of economy and culture. The problem is when you look at this, the systems approach, can this be scaled up? The moment you say that, you've lost the battle. You can't scale these up. These can be scaled sideways perhaps, but not up. So in terms of looking at the fragmentation, which I think is not necessarily a healthy thing, they're looking for some grand revolution to happen. So some of the answers will come from these small pockets of sustainability amidst a larger unsustainable system.
Thank you, Bobby. And Zlatko, I think you've been also waiting patiently with your hand up. Is there something you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you. Maybe following up on these ideas to concretize what the political economic system might be, let's take the example of circular economy. In the UK, there are some research projects on that. And some people say, well, we have to formulate an attractive business case for companies to be part of that. Others say, well, with that, you won't get a really effective circular economy, but you need to add another player. And who is this player? It's the state who should be actively involved in shaping, making this possible, and shaping the circular economy. So in a sense, that's more a general point I would like to make, which is based on Mariana Mazzucato's work. And that is that in the last 40, 50 years, we had a passive state. We had a laissez-faire kind of policy approach, and the state was pulling out. But who solved the last crisis, the Great Depression, or who was a big contributor? It was a state during the Roosevelt administration. So in a sense, one key actor is again bringing a proactive state back and in analyzing how a state policy could support, for example, the circular economy and other research which would be helpful to address the Anthropocene.
Thank you, Zlatko, for that example. And Seray, you have your hand raised. Go ahead. Seray, you're still, yes.
Yeah, sorry. So I was thinking, when we talk about, when we think about systems theory, I think we also should consider our humanity's relation to nature, the human-centered ways of living that we have been sustaining for so long. And going actually back to your earlier question about the feminist ecological theories, that's one thing they bring in terms of the unpaid labor or unpaid work that has been like that perspective. And if we apply that unpaid work perspective to nature, we're totally seeing, I mean, making visible what we have been exploiting, taking out from nature, and all these taking that for granted, leaving their nature's regeneration capacity, don't think about anything, sort of. So I do think that that the technological advances that we talk about, like circular economy, I think part of it sounds good in terms of the ways the supply chains work, and taking the end product into a raw material and so on. But actually, if you think in a more abstract view, it's actually maintaining the efficiency, maintaining the and efficiency is one part of human-centered approaches that we have been relying on. So I mean, the science-based targets discussion that that's going on right now, these are all good, of course. I mean, but I feel like these are transitionary solutions just for this time period. But if you really want to address the thing going on at the planetary scale, I feel like we need to think about human-nature relations. And one way to do that is looking, how can we bring the systems view to down on Earth? Is one thing I can only think is looking at the insights from indigenous communities or other communities that Bobby or Mike mentioning that is actually trying to do something different and creating symbiotic relations with nature. Even though they're very small scale, we can take insights from those. And I feel like that's where we should be going, how we relate to humanity, instead of trying to find temporary solutions like solar panels or wind turbines.
Thank you, Seray. That's a fascinating point about temporary versus more permanent solutions and exactly what kinds of outcomes are we kind of looking for. And Maggie, I saw you place something in the chat about a paper on the role of governments, and I think you've also had some work on the role of corporations lately in sustainability transitions. So would you like to add a little bit about how we might study the proper roles of different actors?
I just hold for a minute. Someone else wants to go on. I'll just have to think about this.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I think I've also been hearing, and one thing I've heard in this conversation is a lot about how we might go about studying things, talking about what level of analysis, talking about what factors to include, which knowledge systems to include, which actors to include. What about the phenomena that we need to explain? Going forward, what kinds of outcomes, and we were talking about measures, so what kinds of outcomes are actually important? Are we going to get to a point where we can, in work I'm doing, I'm trying to understand what a sustainable organization actually looks like as an outcome. I think that's an important thing for us to actually understand. What other outcomes might we look at?
Yeah, so now I'm going to take it. And I think, kind of the measurement is a really important one. And I feel like, and I'm again building a little bit on Irene's paper, which I strongly recommend you read. Maybe Irene, you should put the link in the chat, because I think it's really one of the papers that made me think a lot about this. I feel like right now, when I look at the literature, we've looked a lot in the 80s. There was a lot of work on measuring impacts through toxic release inventory. We were focusing on what does it mean to be green, actually, what does it mean? And then we completely switched to, well, does it pay to be green? So it was just a lot about the dependent variable became profits, mostly. And then now we're going back to actually, how can you get people to change at many levels, and not just actually the level of the firm, but the individual level also, and the level of a country. What does it mean? What does sustainability mean on both the social and the environmental? And it seems like we haven't been thinking much about this. We've let, for example, the leaders right now in measuring impact at the firm level are ESG providers, there are these, kind of organizations that have no really academic, grounding. And they kind of are the one deciding what is green, what is sustainable, what is socially responsible, without us being really involved in this discussion. And I find this, we've really let them take the lead on that. And I feel like that's a problem. At the country level, we now have organizations like the OECD, which are taking the lead in trying to figuring out, how do we measure well-being at the country level? So not just the environment, just GDP, but different types of metrics. At the firm level, we have these, providers. The problem is that they don't provide us with the algorithm. We don't even know how they collect data. We don't really know how they aggregate the data. We have, all of this, I think we need to be way more involved. And then at the individual level also, there's a lot of research right now on footprinting, and I think we need to be much more, active in this. And that's the first step. Of course, when we measure, we know the impact, but it doesn't take, the second step is, okay, now that you know that you are basically screwing the world, what can you do? And you need to kind of have the motivation part. And that's where also I think we can, we can definitely provide our, kind of input on that. But we can't just work on the motivation without knowing, kind of what the problems are. If you want to, if you want to lose weight, for example, you need to know what your weight is and how much, you need to reduce. And I think that's the same thing here. And I would just encourage us to be much more proactive and kind of gather our own data in some ways. We can't just rely on these, kind of private organizations to do that. It needs to be transparent. So that's my, I think on measures, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. And we're at a point where we had a break scheduled, so I'll give Dev the last comment here before we take a short break and transition into our next session.
Well, I just want to say I agree with, Magali, and many of us think that measurement is very powerful. And maybe in our next session, after the break, we're going to discuss working with the physical sciences at some point. But, at UBC I did for a while, and I am again quite actively with energy systems on campus here. And I find that we measure a lot, and as a social scientist, I work with scientists who measure a lot of things, but what gets measured, is not so simple, because it's quite a political thing. I mean, we try to combine our measurements of community impact with their measurements of remediation, reclamation, for instance, in oil sands. And, we work with indigenous groups, we work with companies, and it's quite a free-for-all discussion on the surface as to what is even going to come out. But at the end of the day, what gets really, what's allowed really comes down to what the majors can afford. And a few people then are placated on the side, and then boom, that's what you end up being, the measured thing. So that sort of working process with the science of measurement is really quite troubling when everybody can actually agree what the quasi-social fact is. Where you end up is still very far from there. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah.
Thanks, Dev. So as Dev said, we're going to transition into a scheduled discussion about the physical and social sciences. We can, of course, continue the themes that have come up here. So let's take a couple minutes break and reconvene at 22 after the hour. Stand up, get some coffee, and then we'll be back shortly.
Great.
Thank you.
Are you going to stop the recording while we're...
Just...
Sorry for the interruption, Maggie.
Okay, no, I mean, so we were talking about experiments and experimenting with firms, and that's true that, I mean, in what I've been trying to do, I mean, once you talk to the firm and get something going, and you need something that's identified, you come up with a kind of a couple of messages, and it's true, it's not like the real complete experiment that you would like to conduct. And maybe with governments, there's more kind of leverage to do that kind of bigger types of experiment than with firms directly on the one, on one basis. It's basically maybe the way to go. But I think on the other hand, I mean, experiments in some ways, what they do is also getting us to talk to companies. and telling them what we think is important, and engaging them. So it's always, there's a scientific objective of getting some result and proving something, but there is also the kind of, how can we do this together? What types of solutions could we find, and how can we be creative? And having this dialogue is really important. So maybe experiments not the only way to do this, but how can we engage corporations in talking to us and thinking about new practices with us?
How do you answer that question, Maggie? And Irene, you were talking about this too, about having more impact. So if you'd like to comment, go ahead.
And the other thing is that you have to keep in mind, that's why I hired a behavioral economist into my team. Because I think that what we need to do is actually work with the organizations and see what things work, right? Because there's cultures within organizations as well. So it's fascinating. But anyway, there's so much to do and so little time, but I'm hoping that other people will take this on, the baton, and do some of this work.
And Paul, you have your hand raised, so go ahead.
Yes, it was just on the question of field experiments, which seem so promising, and as Maggie was saying, a potentially terrific way to engage businesses. I think the downside, as I've seen it played out, at least, field experiments seem to have the same limitation as lab experiments do in social psychology, that to get a rigorously defined field experiment, you have to narrow the questions terribly relative to the big ambitions and systemic concerns that we've just been talking about. The interdependencies, all of those just have to be somehow magically controlled for. And hats off to our colleagues who are able to design clever field experiments that somehow encapsulate that complexity. But as with a lot of social psychology, it seems like that sort of the lab condition of a controlled experiment in the field is just as constraining. And so always eager to see what creative colleagues can do using these different research strategies. But I don't hold out great hope that field experiments are going to be our salvation.
Oh yeah, I don't either, Paul. But I'm excited to see that someone can come present something in like a business school setting to my strategy colleagues, and having done something with real organizations and tried to change their behavior and then seen the outcome of it, and that be okay. Because without that setting, I think, Andy was asking earlier, have we been forced to bring our questions down to being very minute and small in order to gain legitimacy and journalism? Absolutely, I would say we have. But I think that happens across every field. I mean, I pick up virtually any management journal, and a lot of the work you see is very incremental and very small moves. I just find it as a technique that can help get away. I also think qualitative comparative analysis is another emerging technique that I have hope in. I'm not saying these things solve everything by any means, but to me, they're different tools for different levels, right? You find something in the field experiment, and then you try to go see, does that hold across a large scale database, and come back to it. I don't really know what else we can do.
And I think in some ways the Nobel Prize in economics went to field experimentation either last year or the year before, and there's already a backlash about how field experiments can't answer every question. So in some ways what we're talking about is just different ways of answering questions, and they all have limitations. And I wonder what ways we need to be using that we haven't been using besides field experiments. So we talked a little bit about the need to move beyond regression and the need to work with practitioners, but development economics has been building that infrastructure for 30 or 40 years. So what kind of infrastructure do we need as a profession to start to engage on some of those alternative knowledge systems, whether it's indigenous knowledge or alternative practitioners, whether it's working directly with firms or working with entrepreneurs? So how do we do that?
I think you have to, insofar as my work with indigenous communities, you have to be, one, very patient, takes a long time. You have to build trust, issues of reciprocity of what you bring back to the community, especially when you have, persons who have been basically abused insofar as their land is possessed, etc. So all these things take time. And, and the publication process is not patient for that. And that's why I encourage people who have tenure to start working on some of these issues so that we can actually talk about different worldviews to solve some of the biggest problems. When I talk to elders, for example, the things they tell me is unbelievable. I mean, they say, look, technology, they keep saying this technology will work. They came to put it in, it ruined the whole land. And we could have told them that wouldn't work and this is what should work, but they didn't listen to us. So these are the things, and then eventually they went back to using what traditionally they've done, for 500,000 of years, and it worked. And then the tech people who got all this money to put this new technology in to drain the water, in fact, failed. But they didn't get the money. So these are the things that are happening, right? It's a question of power. I agree. The power is a huge issue. And that's when indigenous communities are talking about getting their power back. And so these are the things that we're talking about. Well, we need to talk about that as well with companies, the issue of power, what issues, who do they give to? Anyway, but those are all, fascinating topics that I think management and we as scholars can talk about how to solve problems. Who do we learn from? Who do we listen? Who can we co-create some of this knowledge with?
Thank you, Irene. Andy, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I did something recently at Colorado State, and Jeff was there when I did this. I asked everybody in the room, how many people are really concerned about climate change? Everyone raised their hand. I said, how many people are focusing on A-level publications? Everyone kept their hand up. I said, how many people think that A-level publication is going to do anything about climate change? And all the hands came down. They're like, okay, what's going on here? And to my mind, I think, and Jeff and I are having a little riff in the chat on this, too many of us, once we become tenured and certainly we become full, we have the opportunity and the option, and I think the obligation to start to ask the really difficult questions and start to engage a broader community than just our narrow academic communities. Jane Lubchenco, when she was president of the AAAS, talked about science as social contract, that we have an obligation, given quite frankly the privileged life we lead, to try and contribute to solving the problems in society. And a colleague of mine, I won't mention his name, said one of the problems with our field is we have too many senior professors thinking like junior professors. And I think that we need to, a key to the question and the prompt that you gave us, Nicholas, is to broaden the idea of what is our classroom, broaden the idea of what is a professor and what is their role within society. And I think that, we are facing a crisis in academia as well. We've had a crisis of relevance for a while. COVID is going to whack us really hard with the budget crunches. There are going to be school closures. There's going to be a lot of people saying, what are you people doing in that ivory tower? If you saw the study that Wharton did a couple of years ago, they did a study, and a piece of the study said, what's the average price of an A-level management publication given the person hours that go into it? The answer was $400,000. If the purpose of that article is a line on your resume to get a great job at a great university, people have a right to say, what are you guys doing? What is the purpose that you provide to society? There's my soapbox. I'll stop there.
Well, and now we've been talking about systems and systems design this whole time, and now we're talking about the design of our system of knowledge production and how that relates to what we produce and the impact of what we produce. Paul, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been struck by the comments of Irene and Bobby about what we might learn from indigenous communities' efforts. And then Bobby's comments about the difficulty of scaling up some of the successes that people have created in those smaller local contexts. And linking that to Zlatko's comment earlier on about the critical role of the state, of government, in creating the conditions within which enterprises might learn to function in a more environmentally sustainable manner. I think one place we might imagine looking as management scholars is public administration. It's interesting how business schools some business schools still call themselves schools of management rather than business schools. The reality, of course, is that in most cases, our graduates go on to work in business rather than the public sector. But as scholars, we've got plenty of opportunity to go fishing in our field research in whatever waters we want. And I do think that we've got a lot to learn from public administration as a field of scholarly inquiry, and that our engagement with that sister field is really crucial. It used to be sort of one and the same field if you go back to the early years of organizational research, and it's just bifurcated over the decades as a result of the sort of pressures of the business sector on business schools. But the reason I think this, I see that as so promising is because at the end of the day, if we do want to scale up some of the lessons learned locally, it's through governments at the regional and the national, perhaps international levels, and that we're talking about essentially a way of turning government to these critical purposes that we're talking about. In this case, you know, saving civilization from environmental destruction. And in the history of public administration, there's all kinds of fabulous experiments in how to build a more democratic and accountable public service, that whether it's in the regulation of public utilities or citizen input to the regulations formulated by the EPA in the United States across many different countries and many different regions, there's a fabulous history of democratizing experiments within the state system that we can learn from, and that can give people some way of thinking, different ways of thinking about how we might bring state power, government power to bear, reshaping the environment within which businesses and enterprise of various kinds operate. I think part of our challenge these days is a bit like, I've joked in a book I wrote recently about that our difficulty is a bit like the difficulty Aristotle had. Aristotle's a big fan of democracy as long as it was limited to property owning men. Couldn't imagine for the life of him how democracy wouldn't degenerate into rule by the rabble if the franchise were extended to women or slaves. Bright fellow, Aristotle, and a progressive guy for his times, but couldn't for the life of him imagine democratic participation be extended to women or slaves. And I think we face a bit the same dilemma that Aristotle faced in trying to imagine how democratic decision-making could be expanded over the economic arena with sufficient force and sufficient traction as to drive change in the way we produce the stuff we need to live on. But the folks in the public administration have been worried about that issue for a long time. How do we expand? How do we enrich the content of democracy so that it enables society to deal with the big issues, the big challenges we face? So public administration, let's go fishing in public administration.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I added to the chat one of my favorite papers by Henry Mitzberg called Managing Government, Governing Management, which is about this relationship between the role of government, and it was very much building on the Cold War fears about communism winning over democracy, but it's very much in tune with what you're saying. And John, you have had your hand up, go ahead.
I love the idea of empirical research. Really like to engage in it and read it and look at all the nuances that we put in our designs and statistical innovations. But I think in some ways that's a detour, and maybe we need to do more dreaming, come up with metaphors. And I'm picking up on a theme here that to me sounds really important. I don't think there's really that much to learn from capitalist organizations, whatever way we study them. I really don't think traditional capitalist organizations are going to go anywhere. They are inherently destructive. They will harm people and the environment as a way of being. There is nothing that will prevent them if they're not controlled tightly by government. There's nothing, in my view, that prevents them from destroying people and the environment. So, I mean, how far can we go with the anomaly like interface carpets or something? I mean, you know, the only way they've become green, you know, and what is a green organization? The only way they've managed to define themselves as green is with CO2 offsets, greenhouse gas offsets. I mean, I think they've done some interesting things. And if you're interested in incremental change and you're not thinking about impending crises and apocalyptic problems that we face, you know, ice sheets and plastic and insects, all the kind of stuff that is really coming our way from the natural sciences. If you're not thinking about that, we could continue to do empirical research and study the outliers like interface, but I don't know, it seems like there's something else that's needed. I'm not providing it. I don't think I'm providing anything right now, but I need to get busy providing something. But I don't know if it should be empirical research in the traditional way that we've done it, and even in the more innovative ways that qualify us for A-level publications. I mean, can capitalist organizations avoid being harmful? To me, it's an inherently problematic scenario. Political economy set up for private ownership and exploitation has very little chance to help people and the environment. It's for another purpose. And so if we try to transmogrify that purpose, we get at best grudging, struggling, incremental change. So maybe it's the indigenous communities that are off the grid in some way, that are alternative cultures that provide the insights. But I don't think going to Apple or Google or any of the progressive companies, other than to see them challenge the Trump administration, other than that, I don't see what they're doing that's really that helpful for fixing the world.
Thank you, John. We have, it mirrors the kind of paradox for groups like Environmental Defense Fund and Nature Conservancy that have chosen to work with large companies on the philosophy that if we can alter what Walmart does, we can have this huge impact. But is that going to actually change the underlying dynamics? We don't know. They've made that deal. Zlatko, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I leave it to Andy to answer first, and then could I come after Andy?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Wow, how do you know what I'm going to say?
I can imagine. I can imagine.
Well, you know, just riffing off of John's point, the idea that there's a black and white capitalism not, I think opens up a line of attack that is distracting, because what is a capitalistic organization? We live in a version of capitalism, but American capitalism is very different than Norwegian, very different than Japanese. So there are many different forms. It's a very gray, not black and white idea. And I think that when I think about these questions, and a question that was underlying our agenda here today is, do we work within a capitalist system or challenge it? I think that I approach that question as a pragmatic one, and I've always fallen back on Stephen Jay Gould's article, The Creation Myths of Cooperstown, where he says baseball was not invented in 1896 by Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York. That's preposterous. It was a game that was evolving over time, and he merely wrote the rules down as he saw them. Every set of institutions is built on the institutions that precede it. We have a system right now, and the idea of wiping it, and I'm not suggesting you're saying this, John, but I do see some people suggesting we got to come up with something completely new. Naomi Oreskes says we have to, or I'm sorry, Naomi Klein says we have to shred capitalism and come up with something new. That's not possible. You can never wipe the slate clean. So here we are now. Where do we go? That is the challenge before us as researchers, is what are the dimensions of that path? That's, to my mind, a formidable challenge for us as management scholars, and one we should take on. Was that what you thought I was going to say, Zlatko?
Yes, I was quite sure about that. One brief comment on that, and then I add my point I wanted to make. So if you look at the reactions currently during the COVID crisis, and the COVID crisis, wouldn't the COVID crisis be a chance now to change the course, right? Radically to change the course, because everything went down, production and so on and so on. Now it would have been the chance to radically change course, to go towards addressing the Anthropocene, radical restructuring of industry. Did it happen? I don't see it. If you see it, please correct me. I don't see it.
Well, I would say it's not over yet. COVID's not over yet.
Okay, but still, there are some programs done, as far as I've seen in the US, some economic programs, and even in Germany or the EU, which are surely more progressive than in the US, at least from the US government. I don't see it. So that left me quite worried and also quite skeptical in a sense in what to expect from current policymakers. So and that is now the part is coming, which I wanted to make, and that is, you probably need something else. The state as such alone won't change course. I don't see it. The policymakers, they won't change course, which are in power, but we need, what Polanyi said, a social movement, a counter movement, a really strong counter movement, which is going against these kind of policies. And we already see it. We see young people, Fridays for Futures, the Sunrise Movement in the US. And if you would be able to study these movements, maybe help them develop towards something stronger, bigger, that might be a factor which could help change course.
Thank you, Zlatko. And Bobby, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I was going to talk about the COVID thing as well, and also respond to both Andy and John. Yeah, there are varieties of capitalism. And John, you're right. The reason I don't study organizations is because I know that nothing meaningful is going to come from there. I'm a visiting professor at University of Havana, and I go to Cuba every year. I couldn't go this year because of COVID crisis. And even in these so-called communist state-run big organizations, the paradigm is the same. The Cuban cigar maker roller gets paid piece rate. Its whole tailor system. It's not much different. It's all based on quotas, on growth. There's not much difference in those systems of production either. Yes, the state might own the means of production, but the paradigm is still the same in terms of planet is concerned. Coming back to COVID, yes, you're right, Zlatko. I really thought this was an incredible opportunity. You had here, when we were hit hardest around March, the NHS, which is our state medical service, asked for 40,000 volunteers. Within half an hour, they had 500,000. The website crashed. Within the day, they had 2 million volunteers, right? I'm saying, why is that not an economically productive activity? The real question is, how do we design a society where 60% unemployment is the norm, the way we measure unemployment, without descending into anarchy, right? What does that mean? We had competing firms sharing trade secrets about how to make, those are the two Formula One companies, how to make ventilators, how to make gas masks. What if this is the new normal? What is it when these bailouts are given? This country has missed a huge opportunity. At least the EU tried something. They bailed out Air France by saying, we'll give you this money, but you have to cut down 40% of your flights. You cannot compete with the train system. What would it take to completely destroy the airline industry, right? What if there are no passenger flights? Anyway, long distance. Why can't, what is the meaning of work when we're living in a system where, you know, an oil spill is a positive GDP. I get hit by a car that's positive GDP. I grow tomatoes in my backyard. I take care of an aged relative, that's negative, right? So how can that become the new normal? That's a real fundamental question. And you're right, I agree, we missed this great chance. The UK bailout was supposed to be attached with strings attached, that you need to reduce your CO2. There's very little of that, which is why there's a lot of protest. At least France got something right, and Germany got something right. Whether it's going to be enforced or not is a different matter.
Maggie, go ahead.
Yeah, so what can we do? And I think that you're right. We need to change the purpose of the corporation, right? And I'm going back to metrics. I think if, you know, if as a director, what your responsibility is just to shareholders, that's, you know, we're not going to change anything. So I am positively, I mean, I think there's a positive change with, you know, mission corporations and benefit corporations that have different types of metrics for impact, not just profit, but other metrics. And to go back to the example of France, a few actually professors last year were very, very active in the government to pass, to change the law in France to allow for this kind of new form of corporation that includes, you know, impact measurements. And that makes this as one of the responsibilities of the corporation. So I think we can also, you know, with our research and kind of influence what a corporation is legally. And we have these, you know, benefit corporations in the US. I think the half of the states have passed this type of status. But we can be much more active. And if eventually we get our metrics, our sustainability metrics, to be as standardized and required as the general financial metrics, accounting metrics, then I think we're making some progress, at least, a little bit. So so just to go back to, our role, we could also be working on pushing for a different type of legal status and kind of pushing firms to adopt that.
Thank you, Maggie. So the name of this PDW was about building the research agenda for the Anthropocene. It's also about building the community of researchers about the Anthropocene. So we have about 10 minutes left here, and we've touched on this idea a couple times about what we need to do as scholars to continue this work and direct this work in certain ways. I'm hoping for the next 10 minutes we can talk about what we need to do to build that community out in the future. Paul, I see your hand is up. You can go ahead on that topic or something else.
Yes, on this topic, I was jumping to respond because several of us have been involved in an effort to build a community of research along capturing some of the spirit of the discussion today. I know there's been various efforts within the Academy of Management over the years with a stream over the years of PDWs of this kind, without shaping much of the O&E agenda beyond that 1 or 2 PDWs a year. By contrast, within the European Group on Organization Studies, EGOS, there seems to be a more sizable community of scholars very interested in exploring these sorts of issues. We, therefore, several of us on the call here and others overseas, too, put together a proposal that was accepted for a standing working group we're calling System Change, Not Climate Change. And we're hoping we can build 2 parallel and interconnected scholarly communities with using the standing working group at EGOS on the one side and building out the O&E and related scholars within the Academy of Management that can take up the challenge that you've posed to us in this PDW of how to shift our sights to a more systemic level so that corresponds to the challenges of the Anthropocene. So if folks are interested, we've posted in the chat a link to the standing working group description. That program will begin next July at the next EGOS meeting, and we will be working over the coming months to open up some way of expanding the Academy of Management counterpart.
Thank you, Paul. What other work do we need to be doing? And we've also touched about this idea of what are the consequences of building a community like this becoming viewed as activist? I think that some of the research in science communications shows that one of the most effective ways to alienate someone from your message is to have them think you're an activist. So that might be something to consider, how we might do that going forward. Irene.
We're all activists, right? Even if I'm one who just does research on a company and I'm up for profits only, I'm an activist saying profits only matter, shareholders only matter. I mean, we all are sort of promoting something. What we have to say is that how does this fit into the existing literature and how is it different? And why does this add value? And why is this important? And sometimes, I go into a class and half my students don't want to be there, other half are really eager. And I just go in and go, this is why we should care. And then people say, well, this is why maybe this doesn't matter. Okay, let's debate, let's talk about this. Everyone gets into this. So this is what we want to do. We want to get people who, some are activists, some are critical, some are not. This is how we actually engage people. This is how we actually change minds. This is how we expand minds. This is how we look at other literatures. And I think this is great. This is absolutely wonderful. And we can actually expand and go into other areas, whether it's political economy, governance, indigenous literatures, whatever it is that allows us to say, let me see if I can expand what I'm thinking about. Then that, at least we've succeeded. That's our job. And I think if we can do that more and promote that more, we'll be in a much better field.
Thank you, Irene. And Jeff, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So I was talking about this a little bit with the former governor of Colorado. I was lucky enough to get to talk with him, and he was basically elected on a clean energy economy platform. And I thought that was really interesting because it wasn't a renewable energy platform. It wasn't an energy economic growth platform, although we have tons of that, or we didn't until recently with hydraulic fracturing and whatnot. And what he was saying to me, I thought this was an interesting way we could have a bit more leverage, at least in the United States. I don't know. Well, I don't even know if this model would work here, but this is something I'd really like to explore. He's like, you guys, you have a legitimacy with politicians that other academics don't have because you're in a business school. And if you can frame your message to political candidates about why addressing the environmental issues you care about or other issues you care about can help lead to economic growth. And I'm sure this is very unpalatable to many people on this call, but I'm a bit beyond, I mean, I'd like to be ideological and pure about a lot of this, but I don't care anymore. I'm like, what gets anything done? He was saying, if you could frame those talking points in a one-pager, and then you provide for every politician in every state, every county, wherever you write, the closest academic to their big state school, preferably one that has a football team that people love. He's like, I honestly, he's been a politician now. He works at a think tank, very successful. And he's like, I think that's the thing you guys could do to have more impact in the U.S. elections than anything else. Because people will reach out to you. People that run campaigns are always looking for fodder. They're looking for talking points. They're looking for how to differentiate themselves. And if you put that in their inbox and you give them someone with legitimacy to talk to, then they'll do it. So that's not a research question, but it's something we could do that I've ever since he told me that, I'm like, man, I don't know. It resonates with me.
Thank you, Jeff. And Zlatko, and then Maggie, you will have the last comment as we conclude.
Taking up a point Andrew made, and also the new paper of Seray, Andy, and Bobby, they mention in this paper engaged scholarship as a future key issue, and Andrew said, I think rightly, that we in the A journals you probably couldn't publish the stuff which is really relevant at the moment. So if we somehow can increase the chance that engaged scholarship work could be published in A journals. Engaged scholarship, for example, as Paul said, in public administrations. Let's imagine we have someone who is trying to change course and working as a consultant as an advisor for a government. Okay, what are the problems? Why it's not happening? What are the ideas? What are the conflicts? And then could publish that in an A journal. Wouldn't that be interesting research? Wouldn't that be relevant research? You could build on that in developing better strategies to intervene in government, to support government, and that might indeed perhaps make a difference.
And go ahead, Maggie.
Yes, I heard this senior faculty member saying, it took me a long time to get a voice, and now I'm going to use it. And I think it's the same thing with us. It took us a long time to get, legitimacy. Now I think we have it. There's kind of not only just within our group, but as Jeff mentioned, also with regulators and with the financial community. So I would think, now that we have kind of this voice, we should definitely use it. If we don't use it right now with what's going on with COVID, then, we kind of are missing an opportunity. So that's just my final word on this.
Thank you, Maggie. And Bobby has requested a 30-second final comment. So we'll end with Bobby.
Bobby, you're muted.
Yeah, I know. Your moderation is excellent, Nick. You're an outstanding moderator, really. Kudos. No, just quickly to add, Andy talked about what we expect from this communities of practice. And this is the first time we've written together with Seray. And there was like almost shock and horror across the field. Bobby Banerjee riding with Andy Hoffman. So the accusations of Bobby is taking Andy to the dark side, and somebody is telling me Andy's taking Bobby to the dark side. But that's my point, isn't it? The fact that we could sit and find a common ground and then address our respective fields and push them to different directions, right? That's what one would expect from a community like this, right? So I think that's the important part. It's not just I guess asking new questions. It's changing the mode of conversation. It's not even just changing the conversation. It's changing how we converse, and I think that's what we kind of hope to do in that paper. And let's see what happens.
Very true, Bobby. How we converse with each other and how we talk about these issues is absolutely critical.